Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's a rather blustery day here in San Francisco. Having a jaunt around the lake in the late afternoon. It's gray. The regulars are around. Most of those are plants and animals. I've got a few things bubbling in my little soup pot of a mind today. But I think I'm going to start with a couple of things. That have shown up in recent conversations. In one situation, I was with two close companions and we were delving deep for a moment. And for some reason, for me at that moment, I felt I should unburden my heart about something that happened when I was quite young that I regret. I've spoken of this before. There's a peculiar way in which things that we find painful or negative or limiting or shaming or embarrassing or just plain confusing, we can bury these in our heart like thorns, and then if we wiggle that thorn, well, we actually feel our heart. And this can become onanistic in the sense of very intimate self-manipulation. And this is much more deeply true of myself. Like I'm making some kind of huge admission here in waking consciousness, because unless I'm drawn into situations where my heart awakens and there's the potential for joy and play and wonder and creativity and memory and so forth, then for reasons I don't entirely understand, but probably have a lot to do with fear, I keep it kind of closed up. I don't look in there, and I might be scared of the thorns that I've buried in that strange living graveyard inside my mystery self. And just becoming aware of this in a gentle and compassionate way about ourselves. Take 5 minutes and just look into that beautiful, somewhat sacred graveyard in your heart. And without judgment, just survey the thorns there. You can even talk to your heart and say, I want to just have togetherness with you. It doesn't have to be around these thorns, so to speak, right? Using a metaphor there. But this was very surprising to me to discover. And it began with a feeling of reticence, kind of a question in my mind about what I was really doing. And prior to this, one of the things that I think enabled my awareness of this and the possibility of insight around it was a previous discussion, and I'm going to make a long recording about this sometime very soon if I don't talk about it a lot today, which I might. But our interiority is much weirder than that there are parts. As in, for example, IFS. It's much weirder than that. Though that template is interesting and useful in the hands of a skillful person or practitioner. No, what's actually going on a lot of the time, it's going on with me right now, is something that I've come to understand as splitting. And splitting is when I move from my core being into some mode that is familiar. This familiar thing turns out to be super important for humans. Things that feel familiar, we have an affinity for them, we know how they work. And because we feel familiar with them and we have an affinity for them, we also know who we are in the mirror of that mode of us. We know who to be. We know what our role is, even if we don't articulate it in consciousness. And that familiarity draws us into cycles of repetitive behavior, much of which is very self-limiting or inherently debilitating. We lose aspects of our potential and nature, natural intelligence, playfulness, and so forth when we split into roles that are habitually familiar, which are not intrinsically, when they're not intrinsically playful or creative. So this is part of why it's super powerful and important to develop creative aspects, especially in concert with other humans and the living world. To relate with it creatively and playfully and familiarly. So when you see yourself or someone else and you notice that you're repeating a specific pattern that's familiar, this is extremely common in two primary places. Vocational situations, our work, right? That stuff's highly patterned and repetitive and familiar. So it's got huge gravity. And that gravity is helpful in that it makes it easy to hitchhike on it. That's part of what allows us to be conscripted in these ways. So it's helpful in a few senses, right? There's the money you make, there's the routine which keeps you synchronized. There's lots of seeming benefits to that, yeah? But the actual situation is very complicated because, as usual, when we're offered hitchhiking opportunities on products or nations or identities or jobs, the cost can be extremely as invisible as it is severe, and it tends to expand dramatically over even short periods of time. So jobs, right? But the other place that we see ourselves, I see myself, repeating patterns. And even if you bring this to a friend or companion's attention, they're rarely interested. It's very difficult to intrigue them about this enough for them to actually see that something that they're feeling confusion or pain around deeply involves them replaying a pattern that's become as familiar and habitual as it has become invisible to them. And, you know, there are features of our nature as animals and human beings that naturally incline us to seek something primordial, which I think is mostly being counterfeited by these habits, historical role identities, relational roles, vocational roles, ideological roles, religious roles, psychological modes, and so forth. And so we will tend to fall asleep into a kind of spiral that repeats. And there's so much about this that's important to reveal other than just these things. But in general, if you give someone, if you bring to a friend, if you have the capacity to bring to a friend, or someone you meet, an opportunity for greater liberty, there's an important reason why they might resist, sometimes very forcefully. And that reason is they know how the habitual and historical roles they've become familiar with, part of the family of, they know how those work. They know what they will get and not get. An aspect of them knows this, an aspect. And that aspect has become quite addicted, in most cases, to the often poisonous fruit, right? Sour, bad tasting fruit that these roles, commonly produce. And they don't want an actual fruit. The aspect that watches over this stuff in us, which is usually hidden and not particularly friendly to us, I should mention, to our core interiority, it's not the friend of that. Those two things aren't friends. We can replace that aspect. We can give it a better job. We can give a new aspect to that job. One that sees opportunity in novelty and is comfortable with that feeling of letting go of a habitual pattern. No problem. There's no problem there. And seeing a habitually played pattern in our life, thought, mind, communication styles, and so forth. So most of what most of us are, most of the time, is not ourselves. In fact, to see your actual self, you'd have to take off at least a few and possibly many layers of what you could reasonably think of as alien processes. Not aliens as in from another planet, although it might as well be. No, alien processes that we've picked up and become familiar with as we underwent in languaging and enculturation in human representational contexts, cities and nations and churches and schools and armies and sports teams and so forth. A knitting group is a really nice alternative. Right? That's also a culture. You can also have a familiar role in there. Or gardening group, or book reading group. There are some other contexts, but the power and depth and trenchancy of the representational stuff we've become familiar with is staggering to behold. Yeah.
Do you know about that?
Mud hens?
There are two new ones, and she looked them up on her.
Oh, right, these two. Yes, I do know about them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you know what they are?
They look like some kind of a goose, actually, but no, I'm not sure.
I think they're gray log.
Again, please?
Gray lag.
Gray lag? Okay.
That isn't that your phone said gray lag?
Whoop. Oh my gosh. It was a goose, and it was a greater white-fronted goose.
Oh,
Hmm.
okay.
Yeah, it offered those two options, but it ended up being the greater white-fronted goose.
Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you're welcome.
So, the situation that most of us are in most of the time is quite confusing, because we think that our habits and histories and so forth that we've picked up, a bit like how certain insects make a home out of little pieces of flotsam and jetsam or little stones and things, right? Caddisflies. We've done something very similar and we are confused. We think that structure we've assembled, we mistake that for who we are. And we can be extremely bound up in and wedded to these accoutrements, right? Which are not ourselves, but we are very familiar with them. So they are a bit like invisible clothing. Part of them comes off at night when we sleep and dream. But when we awaken, that structure quickly reassembles and we inhabit it. And if you can imagine living among people where no one exercised, no one, right? Whatever that might look like. And then just imagine the difference between someone who does exercise and the rest of the people around them. You'd have a similar situation. Your capacity to enact the insights that I'm highlighting here is so profound that even if you were to just walk a little ways down that road, you would be radically different from nearly everyone you commonly meet. There are many exceptions. But compared to the general folks, they're mostly living through this shell. And unless something wakes me up, for example, what I'm doing right now, I tend to just retreat into this, this little shell. And I'm mostly unaware that I'm doing it. Right? Now, this relates with splitting. So when I said it's not just that there are parts. So right now I have split into a role that's familiar to me. So most of my attention is there. I'm enacting that role to the best of my abilities. And I'm not as present in my body. I'm very much not present in my core because I'm being articulate. And in order to speak articulately, unless I'm in a very casual situation, it requires focus and a lot of energy. It's a bit like improving theater in a way, but a little bit more, structured. Because it's all really about the language and how the language points at invisibles. So, if somebody asks me a question, that's a branching point, and I will split an aspect of myself off. Rarely will I be in touch with my core when I'm responding. And if I were, my response would be very different. Of course, not all questions invite us, give me your heart's answer kind of thing. Nonetheless, I'd be much better off if my core were present and unobstructed. My spirit, my soul, my heart than if there's some reason why they're largely occluded and I'm also splitting. So splitting is any time that your whole being forms a prosthetic aspect, confuses itself subconsciously usually with that aspect, and then begins acting, speaking, doing, thinking, worrying, all these things. Okay? So we have all these aspects. Well, it's not even that we have a bunch of different aspects. It's more like we have a kind of a pseudopod, like an amoeba has. An amorphous, a sort of an amorphous extension that forges itself into different shapes under different circumstances. And usually we've forged more than one of these at a time. And deep inside us, if we were to see how the different branches that have formed relate, we would find quite a bit of conflict. When I speak, there's a silent aspect that mistrusts it, especially if I'm splitting from my core to do so, from my soul and heart. Right? When I'm angry, there's another aspect that's more intelligent, attempting to calm me down. When I'm very concerned about something, I became quite concerned about a problem with a piece of equipment last night. And, I was having sort of, what do they call this? I was ruminating about it throughout the night while I would wake up in bed and so forth. And today I examined the situation again and found it's not really a problem. It's not the kind of problem that I was making it up to be. But this is the other thing, right? A problem gives us a way to be intimate with ourselves, even at the cost of self-development, liberty, self-awareness, insight, love, beauty, to be beautiful with ourselves. What's very surprising is that the self that we think we are is mostly a construct, and it's a fairly bad construct in most cases. There are exceptions. Some of us have aspects of our lives in which we come to life and bring others, we resuscitate and resurrect the souls of others as well. And those are beautiful. I deeply honor those aspects, and yes, they exist. But those are not a problem, right? There's no problem with that. So we can celebrate them and should, and create them opportunities for this together, wherever we can. But for a lot of us, we're stuck in a shell. And even when we are with others, instead of forging a context together that liberates us and resurrects our hearts and our spirits, brings them back to life, we tend to do what's familiar. That stuff has incredible gravity in the behavioral catalog, right? It's so compelling that it nearly drags us into enacting it over and over and over again. One of the aspects of transformation that often happens in beneficial meditation traditions is that these things, the occlusions that ordinarily hide these things from our awareness become more transparent. And so we are more likely to notice when we defect from coherent interiority, coherent self-inviting, self-expressive interiority. And I've watched myself repeat romantic patterns, oh my God. I mean, to an absurd degree. And I've seen friends doing it too. And I think part of it is that an aspect of our interiority that is related to our romantic history lives in this kind of, with one foot anyway, in this graveyard of thorns. And it has vulnerabilities and orienting concerns that tend to draw us into repetitions of the memorial structure over and over again. Particularly, the less aware of it we are, the more common this becomes. Just the chance to become a little bit more aware of when I'm splitting is mind-blowingly enlightening. That's the key that gives me the opportunity to unsplit, right? To reintegrate and feel and be present in my body and my breathing, my heartbeat, my skin. That awareness of, I just forged a new prosthesis and I'm now moving into it to respond from there. Not that that's actually always a problem, but where it's unconscious, there's usually some reasons why it remains occluded. It's convenient to the aspect that's in charge of forging and deploying and enacting these prostheses that they remain invisible to our consciousness. Yeah.
And like our entire society is like collapsing.
So these things have been on my mind, that I undergo splitting, that I forge little prostheses, which I confuse with myself, that lacking a context for deep, heartfelt, authentic play and wonder and learning, I will tend to relate with my heart through these sort of spines, right? That these historical, the catalog of my historical failures, shamings, losses, perceived losses, accidents, trouble. And I'm a bit like a connoisseur in this sense, right? I'll go for the most effective one. And it's not relieving. When I wiggle that, it doesn't feel better, it just hurts. But that pain is self-relation. So that over time can become a kind of displacement of my need for self-attention, not dissimilar to how smoking a cigarette might be. I displace my authentic and deep need for self-love and play and attention, memory and so forth, with manipulating these thorns, briefly, usually, and it doesn't solve the problem and becomes itself a problem over time. So just noticing these things, placing our loving awareness and our curiosity on them is quite profound. even if it's only occasional. There's a huge difference between unconsciously reenacting historical tropes or emotional tropes or sequences of psychological and behavioral transformation, right, that are familiar, and improv. And I just want to highlight that one of the main reasons that we reenact roles that are familiar is that we know how they work, and that means we know who we are within them. And that does soak up some of the burdens, the ambiguity, the novelty, the unknowns. Right? It's much easier to reenact a historically structured sequence and identity than it is to improv. But improv is nearly always more fulfilling, with very few exceptions. So this relates to the ambiguity vigilance prediction problem, right? Familiar roles reduce ambiguity, therefore vigilance doesn't get spun up in the same way. All these things, yeah. We get a lot of kind of shitty benefits from doing this, from behaving this way. And as long as we're unconscious of them, this is a situation where there's like Fort Knox is on one side of you with like a welcome sign above the door and, free semi-trucks to carry your gold. And on the other side, there's like a poop-encrusted penny. And we go for that penny of familiarity almost every time, unless the promise of the situation seems to us very accessible and welcoming and playful. If we had a view from above, from outside ourselves or outside this life, and that view was present in our awareness, we would almost never enact these options. Right? These are coping mechanisms that were developed when we were made to feel helpless or injured, when we felt helpless or injured in a life situation. And so then we structured how the thing works. And we decided to bind to that structure and then identify with it. This is how the world works. This is how I am. I am this way, the world is that way. The situation has demonstrated this. And so, right, it gets kind of written in behavioral stone. If you had any idea how near at hand and how profound the available assets are that are occluded by this, you would nearly never go to that graveyard. Right? And when you did, you'd be aware of it, so you'd be much less likely to reinscribe that same pattern that you've been playing out through all your life. I want to be completely transparent about this. Those patterns are not you. Your likes and dislikes, those are not you either. The you can become is largely unknown to you and would be very surprising to the person who you will tend, like me, to enact instead of improvising. The taste of improving your life and identity is so much richer than the McDonald's food that we feed our hearts and our self-evaluative aspects. that it's important we not get a taste of it. If we were to get a taste of it, then we'd have two choices, right? Regret or enthusiasm. The taste could cause us to turn around and look backwards over the entirety of what we missed out on being and becoming in regret. And that's a very grave weight. And the aspect of us that likes to seek failure and pain likes that aspect. We're very familiar with the shell that we inhabit. If somebody comes along and just threatens it, it's not going to go well for that person usually. Then we enter into kind of, either we're very open and forward-looking, and we see the opportunity and just walk toward it joyfully in the experiment. That works great. But if we turn around and judge our history by the new information, that's a burden that can't be reconciled. So it's very important to look forward into opportunity rather than backward into error or mistake, or however we want to, frame that. And this is why we must be very gentle with these awarenesses and not severe with ourselves or others. Loving, playful, compassionately, shining light on those areas that have remained hidden, habitual, addictive, and very limiting. You came to this birth on an incredible adventure. Whatever's shutting that down, we need to defund that with our awareness, attention, loving kindness, and capacity for joyful self-development. If you watch over your interiority, you'll notice when you do this thing I call splitting, you branch inside. And a lot of that splitting is painful because our core self is not just being not seen or fulfilled or heard or loved or expressed. We're doing what our societies do. Right? We're exchanging the beauty for a momentary stimulation that's often quite negative. So if you just watch over the splitting, even if you split into I like it, right? We think, well, okay, what about the good splitting? Yeah, there's a lot of it. But the decision that we like something is critical evaluative. We're already splitting away from the experience to make that declaration. It takes most of our energy, most of our awareness energy to form a critical observation. It has to collapse a series of manifolds that have so much more power intact that if we could observe the process, we would just stop doing it. It's literally the difference between like the sun and an LED light or a matchstick. Yet we make this choice, I make this choice all the time. Constantly doing this. And it's partly out of habit and partly because I have a long history buried in this representational context. It's very windy now. I hope my wind buffer is working properly. I will explore these topics further in coming recordings. I'm so grateful to have this time with you to explore and see better together and discover more of the accessible depths of our humanity that are often inhibited or occluded in our modern experience and lives. I wish you every blessing, beautiful lives and dreams. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.